Cowboys thought the lonely wife was an easy target. They didn't know the alpha Apache was watching. Sunset bled along the ridgeline, turning the cottonwoods to ghosts, while Widow's Creek exhaled a hush thick with rumor. Eliza Kane tended a single lamp and a homestead that listened for footsteps that never came. Jonah's absence had been a rumor first, then an ache, then ledgered silence stamped into every empty chair. Townsfolk weighed her like coin, some with pity, others with maps in their eyes, and by dusk the trail swallowed more than light. Riders came loose with whiskey and intent, their laughter a paper thing easily torn. Above that quiet, hidden in juniper shadow, Cale moved without noise, a orc in human shape, who had kept a promise older than the road. He left a feather by her gate like a signature. She found only distance and chores. She did not know blades were watching, nor the vows stitched tonight. The riders fancied a prize beneath a widow's roof, imagining easy hands and simpler spoils. They did not imagine a guardian who read the land like scripture, nor a debt Jonah had paid with blood to silence men who bled valleys for silver. Eliza felt the world tilt because something in the wind changed. Not danger itself, but the scent of answer. Her fingers closed around a ring that suddenly weighed like a ledger. Her breath measured a small private forgiveness for a man who might be dead and also might have lied. On the ridge, Cale uncoiled patience into focus, eyes hunting not for gold but for truth. And with one small motion, the night rearranged its loyalties. What will happen when men who think themselves predators discover they have been watched longer than they have lived? A single arrow, a whispered name, a ledger hidden beneath floorboards will decide whether mercy or blood answers tonight. Eliza moved through her small cabin with motions tuned to absence. Each gesture, a careful stitch across an old wound. Autumn light slid through shaken shutters, picking out dust motes that held the memory of other hands. The cradle Jonah carved leaned beside the hearth like an accusation, its grains smoothed by fingers that once promised morning. She swept boards until the fibers shone, folded a shirt whose collar still bore Jonah's scent in a way that tightened something low in her chest, and set a kettle on to warm for supper. Sparrow, a mangy mongrel, who had once curled at Jonah's boots, nosed the hem of her skirt and watched for scraps with a loyalty that matched grief. She tended a small garden in stubborn rows, pressed beams into neat hills, and spoke aloud names of things she intended to keep. Water, fence, bread. Neighbors offered measures of consolation that landed like soft stones, well-meaning, easily discarded. Rumor threaded town talk into patchwork stories. Some swore Jonah had chased fortune and never returned. Others hinted at quarrels with miners who took more than ore. Eliza learned to answer little and do much. Her hands kept the homestead breathing when words would not. On the ridge above Widow's Creek, Cale kept a different kind of watch. He moved along juniper and shale with a silence bred by nights under cold stars, a silhouette carved by patient practice. His father taught him to read the land like scripture. A broken twig meant a hurried passage. Bent grass meant a horse had paused to drink. A scatter of feathers meant a hawk had ridden a draft. Jonah had once saved Cale's sister during a raid, an act that braided their fates in ways neither ledger nor saloon talk could record. The debt was not a matter of coin but of honor, and Cale honored it by standing where horizon met ridge, where he could see the homestead's roof and the bend of the road that fed rumor into town. He kept a small fire at night, more to mark his presence within the landscape than to draw curiosity. Smoke curled low and carefully not to betray his position. When wind carried voices up the slope, he listened for tone more than words, noting when laughter carried an edge and when it softened into something like intent. Eliza's life required arrangements both humble and practical, mending a torn saddle strap, salting a ham, checking the traplines at first light. She wrapped a patch over a child's blanket that never warmed any newborn, humming a tune Jonah favored, and pausing when a memory cut through the rhythm. Her fingers remembered the grain of rope and the curve of a nail. Her shoulders bore the tired angle of someone who slept when hour allowed, and rose before the sun. People stopped by for reasons that ranged from neighborly concern to business disguised as civility. The preacher offered prayers that fell like linen. The smith brought news and a bill. Children ran errands and nosed at mystery because mystery felt like a game. She learned to nod at well-meaning questions and hold a look that said more than explanation. Cale studied small things that make the difference between telling and surviving. He watched how Eliza straightened a picture at the hearth's edge, how she paused when the road sounded at noon, the way she smoothed her hair when someone passed the window. He left a single hawk feather by the gate one afternoon and half buried it in packed dirt as an unseen benediction. The feather was not a warning to the town, nor a boast. It was a private promise placed at the threshold to mean you are not alone. He returned at dusk to sit on a high rock where he could read both river and road, listening to coyotes and the low gossip of cottonwoods. In his chest, Jonah's name hummed like a bell, obligation, memory, and something rounded by respect. The town's men sometimes rode the trail for work and sometimes for appetite. Amos Holt had a face that trusted whiskey more than prayer, and a grin that seldom reached his eye. He lingered at the saloon's edge, rubbed knuckles along a flask's neck, and pried at stories with a tongue made blunt by greed. When he spied Eliza's land from the road, his gaze measured not only acreage, but the possibility of taking what looked unattended. He and his cronies joked about widows, as if pity and predation were two sides of a coin, their talk loosening like a rope and snapping in private. They slowed their horses near fences that sagged in places, and considered easy entries like men considering a low fence as an invitation. The scent of stale alcohol and horse leather rode them into the valley and made the evening air feel thicker. As the sun slid lower, the cowboys' laughter rose in a cadence that made the ridge tight. Cale watched them circle the homestead like birds, noting a bare branch, mapping angles of approach, and where a torch might throw light to blind. He knew how men behave when appetite bent them. Bluster would often cover a question of courage. He tightened his bowstring and checked arrow tips with hands that had known cold better than comfort, placing a measured trust in patience until action proved necessary. The land, responsive to long-standing rituals, seemed to hold its counsel. Cottonwoods rustled warnings, the creek shifted tone, and the air tasted of something that could become rain or blood. Eliza closed the gate and found the half-buried feather. Her palm held the feather's warmth and an odd lift of feeling that mixed hope with the small dread of being watched. She smoothed its barbs between thumb and forefinger, and wondered whether Jonah's absence had drawn the attention of a friend, or a stranger. Sparrow nosed her hand, and she laughed a thin laugh that surprised her own throat. Later she set a lantern by the door and stacked wood near the hearth while listening for hoofbeats. She imagined worst-case visitations, and planned quiet defenses, a loaded rifle beneath the bed, jars of pitch ready to cast, rote knowledge that would favor the one who knew the creek's crossing. She did not want to imagine needing courage, but she had learned to keep it in reserve. Night thickened, and the cowboys drew nearer along the trail. Their voices softened into intent and the occasional clink of gear. Amos's boots crunched nearer to the gate, and one of his men paused to whistle low against the wind. Cale shifted on the ridge, and watched the men's shadowed conversation translate into moves that might become action. He sensed that this was less about conquest and more about testing a line. How far had the town's appetite moved toward force? He would not interfere without cause, but he was ready to act for Jonah's debt and for Eliza's safety. The land held memory, and memory demanded reply. Have you ever felt unseen protection? Share your moment in the comments. Those stories keep us connected and brave right now. Eliza froze when a sound braided with wind and night, a soft scrape along the far side of the cabin, made her palm close around Jonah's old rifle, its wood worn smooth by seasons and absence. She peered into a darkness the lamplight half claimed, breath a small hot thing that did not betray more than caution. Outside the ridge kept patient attendance. Junipers cut shadow into the sky like teeth, and every creak answered a memory she could not bar. In town, the saloon stank of whiskey and worn leather, a place where men traded bold lies and dull courage, and Amos Holt leaned across a table with a grin that never softened, rubbing a flask as if it soothed conscience. He spoke of visiting Eliza as if describing a routine ride, and his companions laughed until noise wore readiness into their hands. An old trapper muttered of a shadow on the ridge, and was dismissed with a curse that tasted like bile. The plan hardened like frost in a low place. Eliza moved through household tasks with a rhythm born of keeping things upright, sweeping, mending, setting supper, securing shutters at dusk. Sparrow, faithful and ragged, circled her ankles. The cradle Jonah carved stood empty by the hearth, a silent ledger of days unmended. Sometimes she pressed her palm to its rim as if touch could conjure presence. She kept a rifle beneath the bed and jars of pitch at hand, not because she wanted war, but because she had learned to make allowance for it. Cale watched from high juniper, reading tracks like sentences, listening for the punctuation of intent. Jonah's debt to Cale's people lived as a small steadiness within him. Memory braided into duty made him a quiet guardian. He placed a hawk feather by the gate one afternoon in a private benediction, half burying it in compacted soil where only wind might find it, and returned each dusk to mark road and river whisper. He tracked the Cowboys' cadence and noted when bravado slipped toward something sharper, when bluff thinned and appetite took a shape. As twilight folded, the Cowboys crested the valley and scanned the homestead, like men browsing goods, measuring fence lines and sagging gates, debating which corner promised easiest entry while jokes thinned into speculation. Amos tested small rituals, stone tossed, whistled note, watching how land answered, and spitting when omen rose like a hawk. They chose a slope that offered cover, and sent two forward to test a latch, boots catching on roots and uneven ground as if the land itself objected to their ease. Cale measured their movement and planned to use their confidence against them. He knew the value of waiting, of letting miscalculation loosen a man's lines. He checked bow and arrow, whispered protective words his mother taught, steadying in case action became necessary, and kept the trapper's rasping warning like a knot in his mind. Not everyone who laughs means kindly. Eliza caught the faint scrape at the door and felt a cold, direct tightening in her chest. She opened into the night with a lantern and let her voice be the first defense, asking who dared approach. Her question fell like a small stone, and the dark answered with a laugh that tried on civility, and then slid into insolence when met by a steady woman standing with iron beneath a blanket. The men faltered because her gaze refused the pity they presumed to deliver, and for a moment the world narrowed to lamp and breath and the texture of waiting. From his perch, Cale saw how the men rearranged their courage when faced with an actual boundary instead of rumor. Amos barked orders that tried to sound practiced and sent a pair to test the latch, while others stayed low near trees. Those two moved clumsily in low light, stumbling over unexpected hollows, and the land seemed to conspire against them. Roots snagging boots, gullies changing the sound of approach, while Cale let wind fold him through shadow and considered cutting off their route, though he still wished to use their overconfidence against them. Within the cabin, Eliza felt her hands steady into practiced readiness, and breathed in controlled intervals so terror could not sharpen into mistake. She gauged which windows she could reach without showing light, where an ember would flare if thrown, how Sparrow might distract or warn. Jonah's rifle, heavy in her arms, felt like a ledger she might have to write into with action should words fail. She thought of ledger lines and hidden entries in Jonah's handwriting she had not yet found that might explain why men favored her claim rather than merely her solitude. The Cowboys' tactics flexed as they found illusion of ease challenged, whispered curses creased faces that favored bravado, and Amos's impatience cracked into a louder bluster. One younger man voiced doubt that their plan was cleverer than it sounded, and Amos silenced him with a scowl that made sound travel like a rumor. Cale noted the small human noises that betray composure. Eliza stepped to the porch and held the lamp aloft without flaring light toward the ridge, speaking again but sharper and naming each man who approached, though she barely knew their faces. Naming reduced what they imagined to fact, and fact required reply. Amos tried a charm that fell coarse, and the men shuffled forward with intent slower than before, their calculated arrogance sliding into an edge of unease. Cale loosened an arrow but did not yet draw a bead. He wanted the certainty that approaching force would not scatter before his plan could take root. A bird called, thin and startled, and the men froze as if they had heard something older than them. The old trapper's warning echoed in the hush. Shadows can watch longer than you think. Cale rose with emotion measured and became part of the ridge's profile, deliberate and shaped to strike with clean necessity. Eliza's grip tightened around the rifle's stock, and she let pulse settle beneath purpose. She folded fear into a shape that would not betray. Between canyon and cabin, a small war of wills prepared to begin, neither side yet sure who would count loss when dawn unrolled its light. When the first man reached for the latch, a whisper of movement answered him from thorn and stone. A thin whistle threaded the air and drew eyes to the ridge. The man flinched and cursed. Amos cursed louder and ordered stillness. That moment stretched long enough for Cale to drop from his perch and melt toward a juniper line, offering a narrowing of sight. He moved like shadow folded into itself, every step a conversation with rock and grass. Eliza watched the motion and steadied, the decision inside her no longer only about self, but about memory and ledger and a promise threaded through two lives. The hesitation tasted of consequence, and consequence often had teeth and fate waited. Dusk fell like a curtain pulled taut across the valley, a smear of copper and shadow folding the homestead into softer shapes. Horses nickered and stamped as Amos Holt and his men trotted beneath the ridge, torches slicing air into ribbons of trembling light. Eliza moved with measured urgency, bolting shutters and stacking wood, every motion a small rebellion against the panic that clambered at her ribs. Sparrow whined at the door and circled, sensing a human alarm she had yet to name. The lantern made a low complaint, and the cradle leaned like a quiet accusation beneath the faint lamp. Outside, the cowboys conferred in hushed tones, planning with the wicked ease of men who confuse appetite with entitlement. They named places to pry, times to push, and how to split whatever profit they imagined hidden in soil and shadow. Amos grinned when he thought of taking what looked unattended, his teeth bright as broken flint in a false smile. Cal watched from high juniper, a silhouette unlike the others, composed of practiced stillness and the kind of patience that counts breath as strategy. He had the map of the land written in memory, where the creek ran swift, where rock held a hollow, which bluff gave cover, and which slope betrayed a footfall. Jonah's name lived within Cal like a small, persistent ember. The debt that tied them together was not tally of coin, but hinge of honor, and the demand that a promise be kept even when all else wanted to forget. Cal read the Cowboys as any hunter reads quarry, noting bravado that might crack under weather, alliance that might splinter with surprise. He checked bow and sinew, smoothed feathered shafts, and let prayer pass between fingers in a whisper of Apache syllables that braided protection into the air. His aim would have to be precise. He intended to wound loud arrogance enough to unstring their confidence without spilling blood that might widen a war he did not choose. Amos and his crew moved to test the gate, two men slipping forward under a low sky, boots finding hollows and catching on unseen roots. They worked like thieves at a ledger, careful to mark entries without drawing notice. Eliza kept the lantern low and her voice steady, asking who made the call like a woman refusing to be catalogued as prey. She named no names, but each syllable bore firmness. The sound of a named boundary altered the balance of intent and insult, and the men grew quieter, unsteady before the truth of a living claim. One of those who approached carried a swagger along with a pocket knife, and a mouth that thought itself clever. He tested the latch as if it were a riddle, and the wood opened a small, complaining sigh. An arrow cut the night with a sound that belonged to a hawk's impatient wing. It struck shoulder, not heart, and pain made the first man howl as torchlight bloomed red across his shirt. Chaos moved fast, a scatter of shouts, a flurry of hooves, as the riders jerked reins and fired into a confusion of night, sparks of gunfire stuttering like angry beetles. Eliza dropped behind the door frame and pressed ring to breast, heart hammering a language of fear and grim resolve. She felt the world tilt inward to the small geometry of house and hearth, and she let breath anchor into purpose. Cal withdrew as quickly as he had struck, shadow folding him back into juniper and stone, careful to leave a token on the porch as a signal rather than a trophy. A hawk feather set with respect beside a scuffed plank. The feather would mean nothing to the Cowboys, a small piece of trivia, but to the woman it would read as covenant. To Cal it was the quiet punctuation that marked his defense and his vow honor. Torches guttered, and men shouted oaths that tried to make violence feel like correction. One by one, they felt the thinness of bravery when met by something unseen and precise. Amos staggered, bleeding and furious, as his planned conquest erupted into a contest he had not expected. Rage sharpened his voice into a command that sought unity in panic. He ordered retreat and cursed the valley. His language turned rougher as fear ate at the edges of swagger and left only survival instincts to bite. Some fired blindly into darkness, bullets chewing at air and wood and scattering dust into starlight, while others clambered to horses, straps creaking like old complaints. Inside her home, Eliza pressed her forehead to the cool wood of the door and whispered Jonah's name, not as an invocation but as a ledger update. An absent man reflected in action taken now, the memory folded into movement that remembered his hands and borrowed their steadiness. Sparrow made a sound like a question, and then a plea nudging at her sleeve, and she moved to gather the dog without flashing light that might betray retreat. Cal kept distance and watched how the men regrouped, noting when strategy dissolved into fear-made flailing. His presence was not for glory, but to ensure that violence had a limit, and that a life not his by blood yet tied by oath would be defended. So he chose a mark that would teach without ending, a wound that would hum as a lesson. Amos's shoulder taught his men that Widow's Creek had a guardian, and that some promises carried teeth. When the Cowboys finally rode back, they were clumsy with haste, panting curses and angry words that tried to stitch dignity over a raw fear. They bled bravado as one who had learned by pain that appetite does not always find reward. Eliza watched from a small window, lantern tucked low, and let a single tear trace a path that had nothing to do with surrender. This was grief turned to vigil. Later, when sound thinned and the valley folded into quieter notes, she opened the door to find the feather and felt a strange warmth, like someone had returned an owed kindness. She set it by the cradle, where the wood and stitches kept silence like a vow, and touched its shaft with fingers that trembled less than they had at dusk. Cal watched the ridge until dawn burned the valley pale, then vanished down a back arroyo to track wolves that might prey on livestock and to check that his action had not drawn further blood beyond what was necessary. In the hush after conflict, Eliza could not say whether she felt gratitude or a new burden. Either way, she understood the ledger had turned and that promises are more dangerous to break than to keep. She wrapped Jonah's ring in cloth and slid it into her pocket, feeling its cold presence like a small anchor, and squared her shoulders toward the coming days, when rumors and men might test more than gate latches. Under a sky that rinsed stars into pale blue, the homestead held scars that would heal and memories that would deepen, stitched by a feather's quiet witness and a single arrow's sharp lesson. Eliza had learned every small betrayal her cabin kept, which plank complained under a foot, which hearthstone loosened after a dry summer, which corner begged for a draught to be stopped on an afternoon that smelled of rain and iron. She pressed at a stone she had not lifted before. A thin edge gave, a ribbon of dust sighed, and her fingers closed on fabric folded like a small, stubborn secret. The cloth felt thick and old in her hand, and a dark stain curled along one fold. She brought it nearer to the lamp, and Jonah's initials, worked in careful hand, stared back at her like an accusation tied to memory. The hush inside made the lamp's glow feel like a single lonely witness. Outside, the sky gathered low and patient gray, and the cottonwoods shivered as though listening for a verdict. The valley leaned inward, the cough of a wagon and a distant dog folded into the hush of weather. Eliza wrapped the cloth in oilskin with hands that moved as if performing a rite, and did not seek gossip. She set the parcel atop Jonah's boots and sat with grief until it tempered into something colder and precise. The discovery was private, so she made it private, letting sorrow slide into purpose until the ache became a tool she could use rather than a weight that broke motion. Cale came down from the ridge as if the land had chosen to send him. Juniper gave way to his silhouette, and he stepped into the yard without fanfare. He didn't knock. His presence alone spoke of the ridge's long watch. When Eliza unfolded the strip and read Jonah's initials, his face did not bend toward pity but to steady recognition. He knelt by the hearth and breathed a prayer in a language that carried the winter of many years. When he spoke, he did so simply. Jonah had not vanished for vanity or cowardice. He had met men bent on cutting into the ridge and had stood in their way. Cale told it plainly. Soldiers from the territories had moved through the hills with axes and drills, searching seams for a vein of silver and paying no heed to the ground's old claims. Jonah argued with them, bargained, and when talk failed, he planted himself between their greed and the places the tribe held as memory. The night that followed had been loud with iron and shouting. Men died and bodies had been hidden. The cloth beneath the stone was proof that someone had bled to shield what those soldiers sought to expose. Jonah had gone to shield graves and work, and had met a price for doing so. Hearing the truth rearranged the ache in Eliza's chest. Absence shifted to a course she could follow. The map Jonah had kept was not a fanciful chart, but a practical ledger of land and work. Eliza found it folded beneath a false drawer bottom, its edges softened by use. Tracks were marked with confident strokes. A stream's blind bend was indicated, a collapsed shaft annotated in shorthand, and beside a small cross, Jonah had penciled a name that read more like a place meant for remembering than a treasure marker. She smoothed the paper with a finger and felt the slow warming of resolve. The map turned rumor into direction. Ink became road under her touch. Cale watched how Eliza handled the paper and admitted that Jonah had been more than a neighbor to him. Years earlier, Jonah had stepped between a raid and a family Cale loved. He had driven a wedge between ruin and survival, and paid a cost that made debt for others unnecessary to consider. Cale had kept watch from the ridge, because he could not repay Jonah with coin. He repaid with vigilance. His confession made their collaboration feel less like convenience, and more like an answer to an oath. The man who had saved a sister in another season deserved more than silence now. They prepared with quiet competence, a pair making readiness out of small things. Eliza oiled the rifle Jonah had favored, mended boots until seams lay smooth, folded cloths into packs shaped to ride beneath saddles, and tucked tins of salted meat and hard bread into hidden pockets. She sewed Jonah's ring into the lining of her coat, so the metal would press cold and close to her ribs, a reminder of why she took the road at dawn. Cale marked approaches from high ground, naming gullies that hid tracks and tree bends that masked footsteps. He showed her where a creek's voice swallowed sound and where a cave mouth might have been dressed with stones to look less like an entrance and more like a hazard. Their planning favored silence because noise wastes advantage. Cale taught practical shames, how to palm a knife so it could be drawn with either hand, how to fold a blanket so it stifled scrap and kept a gun ready without clatter, how to smooth fresh prints into soil to make the ground forget. Eliza's hands learned fast and with a patient hunger. The homestead slid from domicile into staging ground, from memory into mission. Each motion tightened into purpose, and what had been a life sized by absence began to measure itself against a ledger of truth Jonah had tried to keep. Before they left, Cale took a hawk feather from his pack and placed it against the hearth, where she had found the cloth, aligning the shaft parallel to Jonah's initials as if to bind, pledge, and place together. He spoke with the simple steadiness of someone who keeps promises, because promises are better than regret. I swore to his family, he said, voice even. I keep balance. Eliza nodded and did not speak. Her silence gathered the frayed threads of thought into one precise intent. They rose at first light and followed the map. Behind the door's latched sparrow barked once, and a neighbor peered from a shuttered window and then looked away. Ahead lay the ridge Jonah had sketched, a hollow crossing, a leaning tree like a broken signpost, a shaft mouth half closed by rocks. The autumn air felt colder with each step, not from fear alone, but because truth often comes wrapped in a brisk clarity. The creek answered beneath their boots, and the land held a patience that felt older than rumor. As they climbed, Cale pointed out where men would have put camp and where tracks blurred into gullies. In a shallow scoop they found a tin with traces of ash, a nail and a scrap of canvas, a small proof that made theory feel like fact. Eliza pressed the map to her chest and watched ink become path beneath her ribs. The paper warmed with intent. Rain smelled close and the sky tightened to a slate patient. Cale confessed what he had not before said in plain words. He had followed Jonah's tracks years earlier, and had vowed any debt of life would be answered with protection. They made no promises beyond the day. They would see the ridge, read what the land allowed, and then decide how loud truth needed to be. They rode into the canyon under a sky that bristled with rain, wind flattening light until stone and scrub sharpened into hard lines. Eliza held Jonah's map against her thigh, as if the ink could guide muscle, each mark a promise she refused to forget. Cale shaded the paper beneath his coat and steered the mare along a wash where runoff had cut new channels into old ground. Prints showed plainly in the slick mud, and the land kept its small grammar of passage, a hoof dragging here, a boot heel brushing a stone there, signs that told a practiced eye who had moved when. They dismounted where the trail narrowed and worked without sound, hands moving in a rhythm taught by necessity. Eliza shouldered a folding shovel Jonah kept for field repairs, collected a length of twine and a chipped chisel, and read the map with a care that made each notation bloom into direction. Cale removed a pack and checked chords, his fingers steady as he scanned gullies for traces that betrayed recent traffic. Rain threaded through the canyon like breath, and the smell of wet earth tightened their focus, sharpening the need to move cleanly and leave as little evidence as possible. The mine waited half-hidden, its mouth caved by timbers and mud, a deliberate seam stitched over to hide what men wished buried. Eliza pried at a loose plank and then heaved until a black throat opened with a sigh of trapped air. Inside the collapse, the world was colder. Water had pooled, and soil clung to cloth. They cleared a small cavity and found evidence of hurried burial, a ragged trench, coarse wrappings, and a rusted tin once used to hold matches. Bones lay beneath fabric, bleached and fragile, the human proofs of lives reduced to ledger entries and hurried concealment. Eliza pulled a ledger from beneath a sodden canvas, its pages stuck with damp, but names surfaced when she eased them apart. Hands that had kept accounts and carried bribes were recorded in faded ink, columns of payments and initials that read like accusations. Jonah's name appeared in a margin beside a terse note, his handwriting accusing a chain of men who had shipped silver while burying consequence. The paper smelled of iron and old rain, and in that odor's absence condensed into evidence, the discovery snapped open the thin shell of rumor and set a new shape to grief. Cale brushed aside a rusted tin, and his fingers closed on a pendant half buried in grit. Its silver was dulled by years, but its shape and a carved mark matched one his mother had kept against harm. Recognition tightened his chest. The pendant had been left with one of the bodies, as if kin had been marked even during hurried interment. He whispered a name in his language, and the syllables fell among bones like a benediction. The relic made loss intimate and tethered Jonah's fate to a debt Cale had carried through seasons, a promise answered now, not by word but by retrieval. The ledger, bones and pendant braided into proof that soldiers and merchants had conspired to steal silver and conceal the aftermath in shallow graves, turning human loss into entries on a book. Jonah had tried to expose that theft. His map was not a promise of fortune, but a record of violated places and quiet graves. Eliza's sorrow hardened into resolve as truth ranked itself beside mourning. She folded the map and ledger into oilcloth, as if stitching memory into motion, preparing evidence that might force a town and its officials to reckon with what they had tolerated. They gathered artifacts with care, wrapping metal and paper against the weather and handling bone as though it might crumble if treated roughly. Cale's movements were tender and urgent. He understood that relics mattered when stories needed witnesses. Eliza slipped the pendant into her pocket and felt its weight like a language. Rain grew harder, and tracks near a wash suggested recent disturbance, not simply seasons ago. A boot print half covered by debris hinted someone had returned to the place, making the recovery both a discovery and an urgent seizure against forces that might remove or destroy proof. They moved faster, momentum reshaped by necessity. On a ledge they found a crude cross, and at its base lay a scrap Jonah had likely touched, a fragment of cloth that made the throat close for a beat. The marked place read less like a monument and more like an attempt at remembrance, and the sight turned grief into a steadier resolve. Eliza pressed her palm to the rag and felt a pressure that steadied rather than broke. The map's lines had become path, and now the path demanded action, each step forward a choice to make private loss public and to risk the wrath of those who buried truths to protect profit. They sheltered in a water-worn cave and built a small fire that offered heat without sending a signal. There, Cale spoke plainly of raids he had tracked and of soldiers who cut into sacred ground to feed commerce, and Eliza listened as plans took shape. They agreed to bring the ledger to the marshal, to find witnesses who had not been silenced, and to place proof where law might move, though they knew power sometimes prefers secrecy, and that such moves would invite retaliation. Each plan was measured against risk. Truth in these hills often cost more than exposure. Night pressed wet and uneven, and they slept in fits, waking to dawn that tasted of iron. The realization settled: discovery invites danger when power depends on hiding. Eliza tightened pack straps and tucked Jonah's map against her chest. Cale checked bow and arrows and smoothed any hint of haste from his motion. Together they stepped from the cave into the canyon that now carried memory and purpose, each footfall echoing with the promise that truth demands accounting, and that some debts demand the daylight to be paid. At a fork, they paused and chose the Walder cut where brush hid movement and a creek swallowed hooves. Cale scouted ahead and returned with a tight face. The ledger lay warm against Eliza's ribs, as if Jonah himself breathed through its pages, ink named men who traded silver and graves. Carrying proof made them visible to those who preferred secrecy. To shoulder that risk was to turn mourning into action, to trade private sorrow for public reckoning. They moved with deliberate stealth, every footfall measured, every glance a promise that truth would not be buried again. Justice would be their aim. They descended together, map packed, ledger protected, bones wrapped, every motion practical and swift. The canyon held what it would no longer hide. Their passage out would be counted later in lore and rumor. For now it was enough that they had found what had been buried, and that a pendant had returned a name to memory. Have you ever found a truth that changed everything? Share your moment. It's what keeps stories like this alive. Amos rode into the canyon, with a ragged appetite and a shoulder still smoldering from the last encounter, vengeance carved into the lines around his mouth, and turning the gait of his men into something tight and brittle. Rain braided along the ridges, and wind pushed dust into curtains that slapped horses' flanks, making light from torches smear across stone, as if the world had been painted in haste. He led a small company bent on recovery and retribution, faces flushed with drink and bravado, each man masking fear with loud words and small cruelty. Their laughter tried to be armor but sounded thin beneath the sky's rumble. Spurs clicked like impatient punctuation. They moved like wolves, testing a fence, expecting weakness, and hoping the night would hide what they intended to take. Amos scanned the slope for an easy entry and underestimated the depth of the land's memory and the way two people shaped by absence could turn sorrow into cunning. Eliza and Cale slipped from the cave mouth with the practiced silence of those who know how terrain becomes an ally. The ledger, wrapped and heavy, lay secured in an oilcloth bundle. The pendant rested in Eliza's palm and seemed to hold a faint warmth, like a small hearth in the cool air. They had prepared traps that depended more on cleverness than force. Lines of powder and tinder, positioned to use wind and misstep, pits masked by brush and padded with decoy tracks, branches arranged to check a horse's balance and make a man lose his footing. Each device used the canyon's natural angles, turning gullies and ledges into obstacles rather than mere passage. Their plan relied on timing, not slaughter, and on making the attackers learn that appetite meets consequence when the land itself resists. Amos smelled opportunity and rode aggressively, scanning for signs of an easy prize, but he missed the clues the ridge taught. Scuffed stones where people had moved with caution, bent grass indicating recent passage, a pattern of placement that spoke of more than random living. The first man to test their line found powder under a tuft of grass and cursed as sparks licked into dry brush. A bloom of flame answered with sudden brightness and a wind that pushed heat toward faces. Panic moved faster than any ordered strategy. Men shouted while horses reared and gunfire scattered like startled insects. Eliza held behind the shelter and unhooked Jonah's rifle with the patience of someone who had learned steadiness. She breathed with control, let sights steady, and fired where packs and flanks might disable rather than kill, aiming to take mobility from threat and give breath to the chance of escape. Smoke rose and filled the canyon with a bitter tang as fire found tinder prepared to catch. An attacker tried to circle and fell into a shallow pit masked by leaves, his shout swallowed by thunder. Another horse bolted into a line of sharpened brush, and the rider tumbled, stunned and shallow breathing in mud. The storm hammered both sides with equal indifference, washing away prints and soaking torches until their light shivered and died. Eliza moved through smoke and shadow, jaw set, cataloguing what must be held. Ledger pendant, map, evidence of bones, the small comforts that prove what rumor only suggested. Every step considered escape routes and the creek's voice that swallowed noise. She kept sight of Cale's silhouette where he moved like a thought across rock. Cale became visible on a boulder and drew attention on purpose, a bright target meant to rearrange focus. He slashed at a man who charged with a knife and trained muscle, the assailant stumbling as blade and wrist found purchase. Another attacker reached for a rifle and found it wrenched from his hand by a movement both quick and economical. Their motions were matched to need, clean, efficient, without waste of breath or show. There was no room for grandstanding. The canyon demanded practicality where ego might have killed them both. Cale's choices prioritized disabling those who would carry violence further, so justice might be pursued rather than revenge become an end. Amos, furious and stubborn, tried a blunt charge toward the rock where Eliza crouched. He shouted orders that jarred against rain and tried to lead with swagger, but the uneven ground punished boldness, and his horse bucked when the scent of smoke and poison touched its nostril. A line of kerosene redirected his mount, and the animal bolted, throwing him from the saddle in a slide that tore leather and pride. He spat and swore and found himself suddenly small against terrain he had thought simple. The men around him fumbled for cohesion while panic braided into rage. One lit torch too near fuel and a gust sent flame up like an answering voice to their own reckoning. When the immediate threat thinned and the boots retreated into the scrub, Eliza and Cale used the lull to gather what remained. They checked the ledger with hands that turned pages gently, names and dates requiring patience, and a slow, cold reading that felt heavier than any rifle. The pendant warmed in Eliza's palm and now bore grit and the faint iron of blood. Tangible proof of ties the ledger confirmed. They wrapped relics in oilcloth, sealed papers to guard against weather and tampering, and fixed ledger pages with careful knots so removal would be difficult. The cave offered shelter for the moment, a place to tend small wounds and plan next steps. Cale pressed a makeshift bandage into a twisted ankle with the same economy he used to track game. His care was efficient, almost reverent. Saddle strap charred and a half-consumed torch lay where Amos had stumbled. The canyon kept its wounds to itself while rain washed tracks into anonymity, but not want into forgetfulness. They patched what could be mended and left subtle markers for allies who might follow. A flat stone set slightly askew, a notch cut into a juniper's lower branch, signs that would speak to someone who knew how to read the land. They moved out when the weather eased toward the route that would lead them to the marshal, each step deliberate and measured. For Eliza, action replaced helplessness. For Cale, motion answered an owed promise. Together they carried testimony that would unmake convenient lie. Later the town would hum with versions of that night, men telling of fire and rain, of a raid that found teeth instead of treasure. Amos would tend his anger by the campfire and play the part of offended legend, his saddle strap a story he would show as proof of humiliation. Eliza and Cale rode toward daylight, not as conquerors but as witnesses, their packs full of names and paper and a pendant returned to memory. The storm rinsed the canyon but not the truth. The sky would clear and people would have choices to make. They rode into rain and rumor, determined their testimony would outlast fear and buy fragile justice now. In the cave's low light, Eliza spread the ledger across a flat stone and let each inked entry insist on being noticed. Lines named men who had turned extraction into theft, receipts laundering greed into legitimate accounts, signatures transferring blame to paper, while graves received consequences. She read quietly so memory could anchor facts, Names, dates, sums paid, initials that matched mercantile ledgers and shipment logs. Damp paper smelled of mildew and iron. Smudges marked pages where fingers had once tried to clean accounts and where rain had blurred ink into ghosts. The ledger did not ask forgiveness. It demanded reckoning. Outside the cave, the wind carried the valley's slow complaint, and the cottonwoods whispered, as if they too had learned the names carved in the margins. Eliza's hands moved with neat economy, folding corners to mark passages and tracing notations. Jonah had used small loops and slants that meant more than numbers. The evidence altered absence into a trajectory, grief rearranged into duty. Cal watched her with a concentration that made any conversation unnecessary. His presence felt like a rope looped around obligation, an answer to promises smaller mouths could not hold. He had kept vigil not for glory, but because debts of honor can be repaid only by doing, and Jonah's ledger had become the form that doing required. They planned quietly, ledger to the marshal, bones and pendant as corroboration. Witnesses sought beyond the valley where men might speak without fear of tavern reprisal. They knew law sleeps and wakes slowly, that paper could be bought or burned, and that deputies can be swayed by gold or silence, so they measured steps and collected names that could not be erased by rumor alone. Preparations took careful hours. They wrapped brittle pages in oilcloth, bound the pendant in cloth, nested it inside a pack, and hid bone fragments in a tin with sand to preserve traces and prevent careless handling. Eliza practiced what she would say, shaping sentences to strip fury from fact so clerks could record rather than judge. Cal mapped routes where bark muffled hoofbeats and where creek voice would swallow sound. They rose at dawn when mist still cloaked gullies and moved with mounts softened by practiced hands, each hoofful considered like a note in a song sung to avoid notice. The road to town felt like stepping into another skin. Windows shuttered, children turned away from porches, neighbors averted their gaze as if not to be counted. In the marshal's small office, a clerk took the ledger and peered with fingers that did not yet know the value of names. A deputy made copies, and a stamp found paper. Eliza spoke plainly, turning memory into testimony and letting facts stand exposed so that probability could be weighed. The marshal's face shifted as pages turned and figures named men whose authority had once seemed unassailable. Formal steps began, not arrests yet, but warrants could be issued, subpoenas could follow, and records placed beyond mere tavern talk. Word moves fast in small towns, faster than prudence, and Amos did not wait for law to move in its slow, reluctant fashion. He gathered men who still understood threat as right and closed a line across scrub with the blunt certainty of those who plan by fear rather than reason. Rumor of the ledger's transfer likely reached him like smoke. Appetite sharpened into action. Cal smelled movement on the wind and saw riders cut a course that aimed to intercept rather than speak. He made a choice that balanced mission and sacrifice, draw fury away so the ledger could reach safety. He rode the ridge with purposeful noise, beating a path that led the angriest followers into broken ground and gullies that punished haste. The diversion worked in part. Some men stumbled into pits disguised by brush, some horses balked and threw riders into mud, and for a while chaos became protection. Cal favored disabling over killing. Taking mobility from a pursuer allowed law to catch up where vengeance might have turned to endless blood. Still Amos, driven by rage and wounded pride, closed again like a storm. He found Cal's trail and pursued with men who had little to lose and less to regret. They clashed in a narrow wash where horses slipped and men fought with a desperation that made choices blunt and brutal. Cal moved with economy born of training and oath, parrying blows, answering thrusts only when a pause offered no path, and in the exchange he took a wound that would ache for days but accomplished what mattered most. He bought minutes and diverted force. Meanwhile, in the marshal's office, deputies processed pages and began quiet interviews while clerks stamped receipts and placed the ledger under temporary protection. Eliza's testimony, calm and precise, gave record weight to rumor and made it harder for men to erase names with cash or to coax silence. Deputies mounted and followed leads. Some townspeople, seeing official attention, shifted from private gossip to reluctant candor, offering small corroborations that previously remained behind closed doors. Not every witness came forth. and not every inquiry would lead to immediate judgment, but the ledger's movement had started a process that appetite could not entirely stop. News moved through saloons and stables. Some turned to anger and conspiracy, while others, relieved to see action, offered statements that stitched new threads into the web of proof. Amos nursed humiliation and a desire for retribution. His saddle strap bore the dark memory of a burned attempt, and he vowed to return even as deputies questioned others. When dusk fell, Cale had retreated to a low ledge by the creek, and Eliza found him there, leaning against stone with a bandaged shoulder and the fatigue of one who has chosen cost. She knelt and pressed cloth to his wound with hands steady from mending and memory, and he accepted the care without flourish. The pendant rested between them like a small, returned truth, warm against cloth and heavy with story. They understood that moving the ledger from rumor to record invited retaliation, and also enabled courage. Paper stamped and filed changes what neighbors whisper into what juries might consider. Days after exposure, deputies summoned men for questioning, subpoenas moved, and a handful of uncomfortable names shifted color when called to rooms where witnesses waited. Not every guilty man answered, and not every offense turned to punishment overnight, but records now existed, and few could erase the binding power of ink in official hands. Amos continued to scheme in the edges, but the ledger had already altered calculations. Some who had hidden behind silence stepped forward because now they had backing, and others who had hoped to profit found scrutiny where they expected only indifference. In the valley, truth had grown teeth, and the creek carried the news in a different cadence. Eliza rode past cottonwoods with the pendant secure and felt how revelation had reshaped her role from solitary guardian of memory into someone who demanded public accounting. Cale sat beside her for a moment, and they watched deputies move with slow authority, knowing law can falter yet also recognizing how exposure creates opportunity for justice to start. Their choice had cost sweat and blood, yet it reminded a town that silence benefits only those who profit from it. People would now have to decide whether to cling to comfortable lies or to help rebuild honesty, and the ledger would sit in records where hiding was harder than speaking. When have you stood for truth despite risk? Share below and let this reminder travel further than the valley. Stand ready. Eliza rode south beneath a sky that had finally surrendered its gray, the ledger and pendant secreted inside her coat like two heated truths she would not relinquish. Wind braided through her hair and held the valley's last cold in its fingers, while the trail folded into an austere horizon where memory and movement met. She had buried Cale's knife earlier, the blade sunk edge first into a powder of sand and thorn, and the leather strap tied to her saddle as an emblem, a private altar to vows kept and debts repaid. The act felt sacramental and small, a way to carry another person's courage forward without carrying them themselves, and as the sun broke a thin, pale line, she looked back once and saw only the wash of land and the echo of recent fires. At a quiet crossroads, she halted and sealed the pendant inside a cloth-bound box, fastening twine tight and setting the lock with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the shift grief makes toward resolve. The town she later reached breathed slow and careful, its windows polite with distance and its porches keeping secrets like old quilts, stitched into pattern. She bartered for bread and oats in a voice that kept its edges clean, then took a room above a low stable where she wrapped papers against damp and slept with one eye toward the door and the other toward the ledger's maps. By dusk she rode east, and a single arrow lay in the sand near the trail, the shaft tipped with Cale's careful fletching, placed as a marker to show direction and as a promise that he watched the path she chose. She picked up that arrow and let its curve press into her palm as proof that some guardians move between sight and absence with the steadiness of an oath. The desert hummed as she passed, a low sound older than rumor, as if the land itself catalogued what had been gathered and decided when memory could be trusted to justice. Autumn light thinned, and the chill ebbed, but purpose warmed her core. Each mile folded rumor beneath fact, until what remained could be argued only by paper and witness. In small towns, the ledger would matter. Numbers and names carry jurisdiction, where gossip cannot, and Eliza knew that with ink placed in clerks' hands, patience could turn toward consequence. She rode through amber fields and salt flats, among cottonwood ghosts and low scrub, where crows watched from low branches, and the road learned her pace. At a river crossing, she paused to bury Kel's knife strap as tradition demanded, then turned east with a saddle steady and a heart set to move the ledger into daylight, where law might begin its slow work. People noticed her passage in different ways. Some turned away, unwilling to bless trouble with attention. Others watched with an expression that looked like relief, as if proof allowed them to unburden silence. She stopped at a plain where an old woman offered water and whispered a name the ledger had made safe, and Eliza felt a small, fierce warmth that said truth can loosen fear when carried by courage. Her progress was not without cost. Riders moved in rumor behind her, men who stitched threats into shadows and used storms to hide intent. Yet every obstacle only tightened her resolve. At night she read Jonah's handwriting by lantern, the letters like a map of what had been attempted, and the margins full of small human notations that turned accusation into story. She practiced telling the ledger's tale with careful cadence, learning how to make facts stand naked and leave fury uncluttered, because anger can muddle evidence, and she desired plain record over mythology. When she reached the borderlands, a low town with a single marshal's office opened its doors to record, and Eliza placed the ledger on the clerk's desk and watched ink become instrument. The clerk handled pages with a softness that felt like ritual, and a seriousness that turned rumor into protocol, and deputies began to hum a movement that could become law. Eliza sealed the pendant in a chest and wrote Jonah's name across a scrap she tucked inside as if to anchor paper to person, so that memory would travel with proof. She tied Kel's knife's leather strap to her saddle again before leaving town, not to claim battlefield but to keep a reminder near while she rode into uncertain road. Out on the plain, the arrow in sand marked more than direction. It signaled that a connection remains between people even when miles and silence intervene. The land replied, carrying scent and footfall to places where witnesses might speak without fear, and where the ledger's pages would be harder to hide or burn. Her journey east lengthened into a pattern of testimony and travel. She lodged where clerks asked questions, collected signatures from those who dared admit what they had seen, and mailed copies of ledger pages to authorities beyond the county. Each act multiplied risk, but also carved channels for truth to flow, and when men tried to intercept letters or threaten informants, the network she had begun unraveled conspiracy into discrete pieces. Authorities could follow. Months would pass in which she would sleep with pistols near and papers wrapped in oilcloth. Yet with each sunrise she felt a tide lift, as if history itself was correcting under pressure. Someone in a larger town judged the ledger worthy and forwarded warrants, and for the first time the net around illicit merchants tightened in ways Eliza had only hoped could happen. Kel's arrow arrived some nights later with a note wrapped in oilskin, brief, precise, a line that read, "In effect, the land still keeps watch, and we will answer when asked." Her reply was a simple inked line attached to a deputy's hand. "Continue and protect those who speak," and she included a list of names who had already come forward. The public stages of action moved slowly but inexorably, and where law touched greed, men chose, some to confess, others to fight, and a city court would later summon names once thought untouchable. Eliza never sought fame. She sought reckoning and the small mercy of accountability, yet the attention that followed forced her to learn resilience in new ways as letters, subpoenas and threats piled on the desk where she ruled. She rode on, often alone, sometimes accompanied by deputies who had taken on the ledger's weight and now understood what courage required of them, for the chain of proof had grown teeth and needed to be delivered. In taverns, people argued about justice and rumor, and some accused her of stirring trouble while others toasted quiet bravery, and the valley where she had once been simply a widow began to remember her as an agent of truth. She paused one dawn on a ridgeline and thrust the pendant into the ground, burying it in a small hollow wrapped in cloth and earth, then tied the knife strap to the saddle as a workaday talisman, not an end but a continual reminder. The gesture was private yet public in its effect. Memory performed with action, a ritual that kept names alive and promised the land would notice those who sacrificed silence for life. Eliza's final words on the road that day, spoken into wind and dust, were not a boast but an invitation. This story lives wider than anyone's taste for quiet, and it asks participation because justice demands witness. She rode into a horizon that hummed with potential, and with an autumn that warmed towards something like hope, and the ledger's pages lay folded but never forgotten, under oilcloth where ink had become a hammer. Now if you feel Eliza's weight and the ledger's weight press in your hand, if the idea of a promise repaid stirs your blood, subscribe to follow her fight and share how you would honor vows broken and remade. For this tale continues in voices that refuse to be silent, and what comes next will unspool into shocks and reckonings you will not want to. Subscribe now, comment below, and stand with Eliza always to